right. So before we record here, just give me who your personal favorites to reach the Final Four, the teams you're actually rooting for, not who you think, the teams that you're rooting for. I want to hear it.
Oh yeah, no problem. That's easy. For without a doubt, it's welcome to another week on the D3 Datacast. Zach Snyder joined by Matt Snyder. And like our Sweet 16, we're moving on to the next weekend of tournament play. But before we do, we should probably talk about what happened in the opening weekend because quite a bit did. It was a great weekend of tournament action. As we expected, it seems like the tournament never disappoints.
Great weekend of games, Zach. I think we had a bunch of kind of fun upsets. We had some wire to wire games, and the first weekend is so cruel. You get from 64 teams all the way down to 16, so a bunch of teams already eliminated. But let's go through the action here and talk about what actually happened on the court.
Yeah, it seems like it goes fast, right? You talk about going from 64 all the way down to 16 already. Boy, the season feels like a marathon, but the tournament really is a
Yeah.
sprint, and it's over before you know it. Looking forward to another great week. But let's talk about last week first, starting here in the Wesleyan quadrant. We thought the best way to talk through all the games is maybe bring back a view that we had last week where we looked at everyone's odds according to the D3 Datacast computer to move through the bracket round by round. So we'll start in the Wesleyan quadrant. Of course, Wesleyan was our number one overall seed heading into the tournament. And Matt, I don't think there's really a whole lot to say about Wesleyan's performance over the weekend. Kind of the opening weekend that you'd expect from a top overall seed, especially playing at home. They basically just took care of business.
Yeah, you expect it from the number one overall seed. You expect kind of an overmatched 16 seed or so kind of facing them, and that's what it was with Wesleyan. Wesleyan just took care of business all weekend long. They're kind of one of the favorites to get to the Final Four, and I think they still look like that coming out of the first weekend.
Let's move on to I don't know if there's anything you want to say in particular against with the Chatham Gettysburg game. Gettysburg did get the win; they moved on and were knocked out by Wesleyan. And like we said, Wesleyan kind of taking care of business, and that was part of the deal there. But Gettysburg does get the opening round win over Chatham.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, let's move on to Ithaca's upset win over Stockton. And, this was maybe you maybe felt like a bigger upset than it actually was, right? You look at the seeding, it was certainly a big upset. And the way that they had Stockton down, what, I don't know, 21,
Yeah.
22 points at most. It was just like wow, this is huge. So the magnitude of the result, of course, that wasn't the final margin necessarily, but the magnitude of that hole made it feel like maybe an even bigger upset than it was. I mean, you look at the computer expectation and it was, it was like, not even a 60-40 game going in. So really, maybe the computer doesn't see it as like that big of an upset, but it certainly had that feel of an even bigger upset.
Yeah, and we talked about this one particular game going in as kind of like an offense versus defense matchup, Stockton's offense versus Ithaca's defense. I watched a good chunk of this game, especially at the beginning, and it was Ithaca just like hitting from deep. It was actually Ithaca's offense that built that big lead at the beginning. It seemed like they were on fire and Stockton could never just quite all the way catch up. So really impressive performance from Ithaca. I think you're right to point out it's not like a huge upset here, at least by the computer. It was less than a 60-40, so still a pretty even matchup coming in. But Ithaca was really impressive, and I enjoyed seeing that matchup, and I just enjoyed their performance.
So Ithaca gets by Stockton on the neutral court game hosted at WPI. WPI takes out Husson in the opening round, and then it's WPI getting past Ithaca. Ithaca not able to pull off that second upset. So the Engineers move on to face Wesleyan in the Sweet 16.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, out of this pod, WPI gets through to set up that Wesleyan WPI Sweet 16 matchup, so chalk kind of get through. But really, I think Ithaca made things really interesting here. Ultimately, it was WPI on their home court. Credit to them to get through. So that sets up, a really interesting NUMAC versus NESCAC Sweet 16 coming up.
Ramapo, Claremont Mud Scripts go to overtime, Matt, a game that's really fitting of how close the computer saw that matchup. At the end of the day, maybe the home court advantage is what helps propel Ramapo to the win. But just, a classic tournament time fun game with, a great game between two schools that you wouldn't normally see maybe match up. You've got the California school going all the way to the east. So kudos to the committee for making this matchup happen. I think, we were all rewarded with the kind of game that it was.
And I think one of the comments we made on this show about this matchup is that the NJAC and the SCIAC both have had a lot of depth in recent years, 2, 3, 4, 5 teams that have been in the mix in NCAA tournaments, and that this was going to be kind of a fun matchup to see how that played out on the court between representatives of the two conferences. And I think it didn't disappoint. It was a great game, kind of back and forth. I think CMS had a lead, Ramapo came back. Just a really nice, fun NCAA tournament matchup here.
And Ramapo hosting maybe because Drew did not submit paperwork for whatever reason. To host. And so Drew, the pod number one here is on the road playing their opening game at Ramapo. Of course, that turns out to be a neutral court game for their opener there against Mary Washington, but it's Mary Washington continuing their run, knocking off Drew and then knocking off host Ramapo the next night. Heck of a way for the Eagles to move their record above the 500 mark just to get into the tournament, and then ultimately getting that total season record above the 500 mark with 2 wins here in the tournament to move on to the Sweet 16, the only number 4 seed in a pod to do so.
Yeah, really interesting that they came into the tournament. I think it was a 13-14 overall record for Mary Washington. They needed to win those 2 games to even guarantee themselves a 500 or better record on the season, and they do that. Kind of one of those, like you said, one of those rare underseeds to get all the way through the pod. Mary Washington, especially in that first game, they just came out gangbusters against Drew. Really impressive weekend for them, and I'm sure next weekend Emory's not going to take them lightly.
Yeah, so Drew here looking at this quadrant, the only opening weekend favorite to not make it out of the first weekend, and didn't even have the chance to play for it coming out of the first weekend with that opening round loss to Mary Washington. All right, wrapping up with the pod that was at Emory. This is one we've talked a lot about in our bracket reactions because it was kind of forced based on geography, Guilford and Barry, and then Emory and Huntington. Geographically, it was just a natural fit. But one of the quirks we did see was that because of the regular season matchup between Barry and Emory, what we thought would be the pairings was flipped, right? In terms of true seeding, Guilford would have been playing Huntington and it would have been Barry against Emory, but Barry and Emory had already played, and so those opponents were flipped. But we also noted that in terms of how the computer rankings see them, the D3 Datacast efficiency ratings actually saw that the way that the committee put it was more appropriate. Of course, that's not how the decision or why the decision was made, but it ended up working out. And maybe that's to Barry's benefit because they pull off the upset over Guilford in round 1. Emory knocks off Huntington, and then the host Emory Eagles knock off Barry to get out of the first weekend.
Yeah, Zach, you're right. By NPI, Guilford gets the favorable draw here, getting a lower seeded team, kind of quote unquote. But as you called out, the computer efficiency rating saw Barry as a stronger team as maybe NPI did. That was a more difficult matchup for Guilford, pretty close to a 60-40 coming in. And Barry wins that one. So great credit to them. Guilford had just come off of that big ODAC run in the championship game, and you knew this was going to be a tough matchup no matter what. But Barry then able to defeat the ODAC tournament champions here and set up their matchup with Emory the next night. Emory, though, just too much. One of the favorites out of this whole quadrant here, and Emory gets through and looks strong doing it.
So it'll be Wesleyan, WPI, Mary Washington, and Emory moving on to the sectional round, and that will be hosted at Wesleyan. Let's move on to the NYU quadrant. NYU gets a huge win over Cortland. And then, last week we talked about that matchup between York and John Carroll being very tight, a tight matchup and likely hinged on the home court advantage. And that really seems to be the way that it played out. With NYU unable to host, the pod gets shifted, so to speak, to York, and a close matchup tied at the half, 2-point win for York. That's inside the computer's home court advantage, and so just like we thought, it was a very tight matchup. That it does indeed seem, if you take that home court advantage number into account, that definitely was part of the difference.
Yeah, credit to York for taking advantage of getting the home court advantage there due to the NYU men not being able to host first weekend. It moves to York. And like you said, that very well could have just tipped what was otherwise a pretty close to 50-50 or 60-40 game into their favor. And they took advantage. John Carroll just came up short. John Carroll had a good season. They were a strong team as well. But York advanced to play the NYU team. NYU then too much for anyone else in this pod, I guess, on this weekend, and they advance. They look strong. They're still one of the computers' favorites to reach the Final Four after this weekend. And yeah, congrats to the Violets for getting through to the Sweet 16.
Yeah, another top seed that basically, took care of business on opening weekend. Although, that second round game of York being a true road game, and the score was close enough
Yeah,
to make it a little bit interesting, and definitely one that I looked at and then saw like, I might want to tune into this one just to watch it play out down the stretch. But it seemed like NYU was always holding York at arm's length,
sure.
right? So it didn't get too interesting, but it was one of those that was, at least interesting enough just to see what might happen
Yeah.
there. Okay, let's go down to our Texas pod. Cal Lou drops their opener to Hardin Simmons. St. Thomas takes care of Lewis and Clark. And then, Matt, it's Hardin Simmons getting another big win as they knock off host St. Thomas. St. Thomas is one of those teams, one of those hosts that we talked about last week that, they were seen by the computer as favorites to get out of the opening weekend, but it was, overall odds less than 50%. So, they maybe had the best odds according to the computer, but that was one that the computer saw as the
Yeah.
field being more likely than the host. And that's what we see with Hardin Simmons, the one moving on to the Sweet 16.
Yeah, interesting that we had the Texas pod and it became an all Texas final, and then it was Hardin Simmons that went there and got through. I think a couple of interesting matchups here. I think that Cal Lutheran Hardin Simmons matchup was good and interesting, and then the St. Thomas final for Hardin Simmons was also good and interesting. And yeah, Hardin Simmons moves on. They're going to travel all the way out to NYU next weekend, and that should be another interesting matchup between teams that you don't get to pair up too often. So it'll be fun to see here in the Sweet 16.
All right, time to talk NJAC again. It was a four-bid league, Matt, and there was some problems to talk about earlier on, and that's going to happen again here as we talk about TCNJ. They were down big to Pitt Bradford, had a big second half, but it wasn't enough as TCNJ drops a 2-point game to Pitt Bradford. Hampton Sydney had an easy time with Bryn Athen, but a less easy time with Pitt Bradford. 4-point game at the half, 6-point final margin. And so I think, one of the takeaways you have to say, shout out to Pitt Bradford,
Yeah.
one of those teams that, had a shiny record, but maybe you wonder a little bit about the strength of schedule overall. But, a win over TCNJ, a really competitive game against Hampton Sydney, a nice tournament showing for Pitt Bradford, and, really represented the AMCC very well, I thought.
Yeah, and they really jumped out on TCNJ. That looked like a game that was, it was kind of out of hand early. TCNJ started to reel them back, but kind of ran out of time. Didn't quite look like TCNJ was maybe sure of what they were in for. It's always to play a type of team like Pitt Bradford. I think you can watch film and you can try to practice it, but until you see the real thing, it's probably difficult. Maybe if TCNJ had a third half, things would have been different. But then Pitt Bradford turns around and has a really impressive game against Hampton Sydney. I think that one was pretty tight all the way through, Zach, wasn't it? And made Hampton Sydney work for everything. So even though Hampton Sydney gets back to the Sweet 16, a round they're familiar with, I think Pitt Bradford ends up being kind of, as you said, one of the teams I was more impressed with coming out of the first weekend, even though they are 1-1 and ended up eliminated.
One more pot in this quadrant. Let's look at another great use of a flight by a committee, giving us a matchup we don't usually see with another California team going way east. That was Redlands getting a chance to take on a team from Maine, about as opposite corners as you can get
Yep.
in the D3 world. Redlands beats St. Joseph, Maine. And then, in the first game of the tournament, always fun to get that early afternoon game, this time with Tufts and Yeshiva. Much talked about rematch of a regular season game that was just an 8-point game in the regular season. And it was a bit of a different story here. Yeshiva having a hard time with Tufts. Tufts kind of ends up cruising to the victory a bit. And then the next night, Tufts really has Redlands on the ropes. A 17-point lead, but it's Redlands coming all the way back, forcing overtime, and ultimately winning it. Big time match, big time weekend there for Redlands, and they've got another weekend to play.
Yeah, Zach, let me go back to the Tufts Yeshiva game for a bit, because that was the only game kind of start to finish that was on that first Friday. So
Right.
I think a lot of people got to watch a lot of it. Tufts was up by about 20 or so at halftime. And then Yeshiva did reel them all the way into like 8 or 9 or so. But then after they got to that point, I don't think it was really any closer than that. Then Tufts kind of comes out and puts the pedal down to finish the game and really finished up strong and maybe it finished around 18 or 19 or so. Because I think I said that Yeshiva was going to cover the 19 and a half, and I think they just did. But yeah, Redlands, what a weekend! You just talked about that. That Saturday game between Redlands and Tufts. Tufts was out strong. They had that lead. I think you said it was 17. I think that's correct. And then the last like 5 minutes or so, Redlands just put on the pressure again. You know, they always kind of play that pressure defense where they're going to make you bring the ball all the way up the court, and it's going to be difficult. Even in the half court, they're going to pressure you. But they played a hard press, and they forced a lot of turnovers. It would put Tufts on the back foot, and then just the 3-pointers also started going down, including with like no time, almost no time on the clock. I think it was Chosen Amadi with like a step back three, hits it just about at the buzzer to force overtime. And then overtime was great. So that was just an incredible like last 5 or 10 minutes of regulation and overtime. One of the treats of the tournament so far, and kind of fun. I mean, it would have been fun for anyone to go on, but Redlands with just the style and energy that they play the game with, I think they're a fun addition to the Sweet 16.
So it's NYU, Hardin Simmons, Redlands, and Hampton-Sydney moving on to the sectional round. This will be hosted at NYU, and this is really a quadrant. I mean, NYU was the big boy at the top, but this one, other than that, has really opened up. You know, Hampton-Sydney you'd kind of look at as like a 3 seed in this part of the bracket, but otherwise you're talking about, you know, a 12-ish seed and Redlands team that entered the tournament kind of like a 10 seed. But you know, those teams have definitely earned their way there. I think, you know, Redlands in particular, you know, they're going to be real challengers there. I'm really looking forward to that matchup with Hampton-Sydney, and let's see what happens. All right, halfway through the bracket, let's go to what was the UW Platteville quadrant as one of those other top 4 overall seeds. Matt, it's still the Platteville quadrant, but it no longer includes Platteville after you know, failing to come out of that opening weekend, much like Widener in the Widener quadrant a year ago.
Yeah.
Just to reset, they get past Grinnell in the first round. But in that game that took place at Platteville earlier in the day, Wisconsin Lutheran with a really good performance to give Calvin their first loss after a 20-game winning streak. And then they turn around and knock off the hosts. Wisconsin Lutheran used a second half 15-0 run to turn what was like a 12 or 13 point deficit into a lead. And just kind of a crazy ending. Maybe go back and watch it if you haven't checked that out. But ends up going to overtime. Wisconsin Lutheran pulls it out, and they are on to the Sweet 16.
Yeah, Zach, Wisconsin Lutheran would be my vote for who won the weekend, the opening weekend of the tournament. I think it was mentioned this was the only pod that had 3 teams ranked inside the D3Hoops.com top 25 poll. Wisconsin Lutheran has to beat whatever, what were they, like number 11 or so, Calvin, and then number 2 or so, or 2 or 3, Platteville, to go on. And they do that. They had a really impressive weekend. That the last 5 minutes in that Platteville game was really tight. It was a couple of points either way. And then to kind of have that, I guess it was a foul, last couple of free throws made to force overtime, maybe 2 out of 3 free throws made to force overtime, and then winning in overtime. Just a really impressive weekend for Wisconsin Lutheran after they had maybe a little bit more not like a ton of questionable results, but they had lost the game in the Northern Athletics and they lost the championship game in the Northern Athletics. And I think some people had started to wonder, myself included, had their kind of early season magic started to run out. Answer, no. They looked strong. They had a great weekend. Wisconsin Lutheran onto the Sweet 16.
To the pod at Wash U, you know, Franklin entered the tournament hot after, you know, winning the HCAC, and they continued that with an upset win over Denison. And in the other game, Wash U gets past Central in what was a pretty competitive
Yeah.
game, and you know, maybe actually the most competitive game of that pod. Wash U turns around and disposes of Franklin rather easily. And just to put this pod in context of the pod we just talked about, Matt, this sets up a rematch of last year's classic first round matchup between Wash U and Wisconsin Lutheran. That was a 71-68 overtime win by Wash U, and really both teams brought a lot back, right? So there's a lot of the rosters this year were on that team, were part of that game a year ago. So this is going to be a really interesting Sweet 16 game to watch, given that history from the tournament a year ago.
Yeah, this was a pod. Was Washington U was expected to come through, and they did. It wasn't always easy for them, even given the first round match with Central, and then getting Franklin in the second round. I guess the Franklin game was maybe a lot easier than the Central game for them. But credit to Franklin for being feisty, beating Denison in a big upset. In a relatively big upset in the first weekend, but Wash U getting through, I think that's where we kind of have expected to see them all season, is in the Sweet 16, and here the Bears will be playing on another weekend.
St. John's was involved in a couple tournament classics and a win over Chicago, and then a loss to Illinois Wesleyan. And that game, that matchup with Illinois Wesleyan in particular, felt like one and looked like one that we could have gotten a couple rounds later. A great game. Um, of course, that nothing to forget about how great of a game that was in their opener against Chicago. But ultimately, it's Illinois Wesleyan emerging from what might have been, the toughest pod overall. Though part of that label's due to that first round matchup we got between St. John's and Chicago. But Illinois Wesleyan, after cruise into a victory in their opening round game, got a tough, well earned win over St. John's to move on to the Sweet 16.
Yeah, I think Bethany Lutheran clearly overmatched in this pod. They had to come from the fourth seed in the UMAC to win the AQ to get here. Illinois Wesleyan beats them rather handily. But then St. John's, Zach, I think got both sides of it this weekend. I think they found themselves on the defensive end in the critical possession at the end of the game. They were up, I think, 2 against Chicago. Chicago couldn't get the basket to go. St. John's wins that on Friday night. And then Saturday, I think it was game tied. Illinois Wesleyan misses a shot but gets the offensive rebound and kind of then a turnaround in the lane. More or less a putback, not an immediate putback, but gets a shot to go. Carlo Kolak to win that game by 2. I think this was a really strong pod. Again, outside of Bethany Lutheran, who was overmatched, 3 other teams in what our computer says would be the top 20 of the country. We knew that second night game was going to be just amazing, and I think it was. It was one of those classic games where I don't know if it was exactly like 5 points either way the whole game, but it kind of felt like it. It felt like it was only a possession or two. Anytime I checked the score or tuned in to watch it, I watched big chunks of this game, and it was just one of those matchups you like to see. And yeah, it happened to come in the round of 32. It could have come in the round of 16 or the round of 8, but it came in right now. And in seeding wise, I think that was fairly fair that this is when it happened. But it was a great game, a great tournament game, and I think this quadrant, especially this group of teams, is going to get those types of games the rest of the way.
Moving on to lacrosse, who took care of business against Grinnell. But there earlier in the game at lacrosse, St. Norbert jumped way on top of Carthage, held on to take the possibility of the CCIW having 2 Sweet 16 teams off the table. Matt, and we talked about Pitt Bradford, a nice showing. I think you take the St. Norbert win over Carthage and put that together with what Wisconsin Lutheran did. Nice showing for the NACC.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, getting 2 teams into the second round, a team into the Sweet 16. But yeah, that St. Norbert, they jumped out to that big lead. I wasn't watching a ton of this game because I think that the Calvin Wisconsin Lutheran game was on at basically the same time. But I was doing a lot of scoreboard watching while this game was going on. And then Carthage, credit to them, they were fighting all the way back. That was just like a 2-point game at the end. So basically Carthage did come all the way back and had a chance to kind of win this game at the end. But yeah, really, really nice showing. Fascinating that what the computer saw is essentially a 50-50 game. At the end, it wasn't that way all the way through, but at the end almost ended up that way. And it was St. Norbert winning. But I think you're right. Yeah, the Northern Athletics Conference, not the first conference we talk about when talking about strength around the country, but they had a really nice weekend in this quadrant. Even though, St. Norbert is going home right now, it was still a strong showing from them.
And then, lacrosse does get the win over St. Norbert there in the second round. So they move on, and they will host the sectional round, being joined by Illinois Wesleyan, Wash U, and Wisconsin Lutheran. All right, one more quadrant to talk about. That's the Trinity quadrant. And Trinity takes care of business, which, shouldn't be a surprise given, maybe not a surprise given what we saw out of most of the other top seeds, but you take a look at the rest of the top 8 and maybe also shouldn't be taken for granted.
Yeah, Trinity was the computer favorite coming into the weekend. They looked strong, I guess, coming out of this pod. They took care of business against Newman and then Keene State. And ends up being chalk held through the first weekend. So let's see if Trinity can maintain that kind of favorite status going on.
Keene got a win over Clark before dropping in the second round to Trinity, Connecticut. But Matt, I think we should stop and recognize that's a nice accomplishment for a Keene State program that they've been no stranger to the tournament, to advancing deep in the tournament. But uh, I think amidst all that, we haven't maybe fully appreciated all that program has gone through, all the turnover. This is now the third consecutive NCAA tournament that they've been able to win a game
Yeah.
with three different
Different
head coaches.
coaches.
So a lot of
Yeah.
turnover there recently in the Keene State program. But here, another win. They were able to get an NCAA tournament win. Okay, Western New England got an upset win over Hamilton, Matt, in a game that I thought, you look at the final margin of 10 points, and as I was tuned in there to the end of the first half, I thought there was a 3 or 4 minute mark there going into halftime that was really pivotal as it turned, what was a tight game, a tight first half, into a 9 point halftime lead. Compare that to the 10 point final margin. I think that stretch really stood out. And it was an upset. You've got what's kind of seen as like a smaller conference taking out a NESCAC team. But Matt, that gives the CNE, formerly the Commonwealth Coast Conference, 2 wins over the NESCAC in the last 3 tournaments. Of course, it was Nichols getting a win over Middlebury in the 2023 second round as part of that Nichols run to the sectional final. But that wasn't it for Western New England, following it up with a win over host Montclair State. And, we've talked a lot about the NJAC here, Matt, but that's the last time we're going to talk about the NJAC. It's the 4-bid league. We had 2 eliminated in the first round, 2 hosts advanced to the second round, but none advanced to the second weekend.
Yeah, I think it was interesting what we would see from the NJAC. They were obviously a good and strong league, but in the computer efficiency ratings type of a situation, they weren't really like top 20 type teams. There was a bunch of teams just in that like second tier, maybe just outside the top 25. That's kind of how they'd been on my ballot as well. So even though it was a deep league with a lot of strength, maybe a little bit like the American Rivers last year, we weren't sure how deep they were all going to go. I think Nebraska Wesleyan did make a kind of a deeper run into the tournament. But yeah, it's the NJAC getting eliminated after getting 4 teams in. But a lot of credit to Western New England. Hamilton did start hitting shots in that second half to make it close, but WNE just had enough. They kept pulling. They made big shots. They made big free throws down the stretch. And credit to this conference. I don't know what it is, but come tournament time, Nichols has gone on some runs. Here we have Western New England in the Sweet 16. I don't think it's just a case of no one gives them credit or no one believes, because during the season, they don't always get this type of results. They're capable of winning games, but it's not like they're out like beating NESCACs left and right in the regular season. I don't know exactly what it is. Maybe it's just come tournament time, things are clicking for them. Maybe it's just a bunch of random variation, but they deserve a lot of credit for being able to get usually just, one team into the tournament more often than not, but then going on deep runs after that. I think it's really impressive.
Okay, Matt, Roanoke survived an upset bid by Pfeiffer and then survived a comeback attempt to win at Christopher Newport. Christopher Newport got a relatively easy win over John Jay. And actually, scoreboard watching that one looked pretty competitive for a half, and then Christopher Newport pulled away in the second half. But credit Roanoke. It was no given that they were going to be in the second round with the way that game was playing out, but they avoid the upset and then get the true road win in a game that they had a lead and then the lead shrunk. But they do move on to the Sweet 16.
They were big favorites against Pfeiffer. I'm talking about Roanoke here. And Pfeiffer was incredibly hot early in that game. And I feel like every time I tuned in, I tuned in because it looked like Roanoke was decreasing the lead, cutting into the lead, but then Pfeiffer would be like boom, boom, and they would take it right back up to 12 or 13 or whatever. I then tuned away from this game. It was almost at the point where like, oh, I don't think Roanoke's going to be able to come back. I go check out another game somewhere else, and then I think I messaged you, Zach, like, oh my goodness, Roanoke won this game by 1. So it was one of those like incredible finishes. I feel like this is Roanoke to me from the outside. You're going to check into their game in the first half and they're going to be up 18. And then you're like, oh, Roanoke's going to have it on cruise control. This one's good. You check out of that game. And then later on, you found out that they like lost that game. Or the opposite is the case. They're down big and you're like, well, it looks like Roanoke's struggling tonight. And then they will come up and like win on a buzzer beater or something crazy. If you're playing Roanoke, it doesn't matter if you're up or down. Just stay in the game because things are going to change. It's going to get close because that seems like how it always is.
Yeah, that's exactly the way this weekend went, except for in that second game, the lead kind of went away, but they did not lose. They
They did
won.
not
So
lose, yeah.
they're on, giving the ODAC another team there in the Sweet 16. Okay, Matt, you mentioned that you thought Wisconsin Lutheran might be your answer to like who won the weekend. And another team that maybe
Yeah.
has an argument in that one is Catholic, who had a 34-point takedown of Franklin and Marshall in a true road game. And maybe was one of the big surprises of the first round, considering the margin and what was heading in, seen as a fairly even game. But that's not all, Matt. Randolph-Macon easily took care of Westfield State, but then it was Catholic getting the win over Randolph-Macon, right? So
Yeah.
big weekend from the Cardinals. Another one of those top 8 overall seeds to go down. Not only that, but the computer gave Randolph-Macon the fifth best odds to win it all. And here they're out in the opening weekend. Matt, I had to go back and look because I thought, boy, it seems strange to not have Randolph-Macon in the Sweet 16. And indeed it is. This will be the first Sweet 16 without Randolph-Macon since 2018.
They've been a great program. They still are a great program in the second round this year. They're bound to take a sort of quote unquote upset loss at some point. And I guess this was it against a Catholic team who was playing great. Like that's not too big of an upset. Catholic is a team that had spent time in the top 25 this year. Zach, I tried to tune into a bunch of games for at least a few minutes if I could. I like the staggered start times so you can kind of get things going. I don't think I tuned into the Catholic Franklin Marshall game at all because by the time I was like checking in on things, Catholic had already seemed to be like blowing the doors off of Franklin and Marshall, and that's what happened. So I just didn't even like bother tuning into that one, just because of how crazy it was. And I think you're right. I think Catholic is also in that mix for who won the weekend. They had as impressive of a weekend, just given who they beat and the margins as anyone. They end up taking a big step forward in the computer efficiency ratings just because of how impressive this weekend was. So Catholic looked awesome. They'll be on to the Sweet 16 and interested to see what they can do next weekend.
The sectional will be hosted by Trinity, Connecticut. They are joined again in review by Western New England, Roanoke, and Catholic in that sectional. So that's the opening weekend, Matt. Any big picture takeaways or things that you're thinking about as we move on from the first weekend to the second weekend?
I just how interesting the results are if you just look at the wins and losses based on who we expect is going to win. I think it's just another season that's a testament to how much parity we have in Division III. We've got a bunch of teams, like Western New England going on winning 2 games, but that wasn't that. I mean, they were like a 30% to beat Hamilton, so that wasn't like a crazy upset. I think we had a lot of those types of games where the 30 or 40% team wins. Seems kind of surprising, but I think that's the parity level we're in Division III basketball, particularly Division III men's basketball. A couple years in a row, we've talked about going into the tournament. You have maybe 16 or teams where you wouldn't be surprised if any of these teams win it, and then you have another like 20 teams behind them who can make deep runs into the tournament. I think that's what we're seeing this year. We've got a bunch of places where almost anyone can beat anyone. I think we saw that in the first weekend in a lot of places around the country.
Yeah, that's certainly what we saw a year ago when you could take a collection of, maybe 10 or 12 teams that you wouldn't necessarily be surprised if won at all. And, Trine was in that group, even though they maybe not would have not been one of the favorites you picked out necessarily. But as you've watched the season play out, you could create a larger bucket. And when it came down to it, they were definitely playing the best basketball of anyone there that
Yeah.
Final Four weekend. And I think that's what we're going to be looking for here is there's a bunch of teams that can win it. It's just a matter of who's going to be playing their best come that time. A couple other high level notes, Matt. We talk about like the championship odds as seen by the D3 Datacast computer, which of course is a function of how good the computer thinks you are, and then like what kind of a path you have through there. But the fourth, fifth, and sixth best odds entering the tournament to win it all are all gone, right? So that's really clearing a lot of space there. We saw in particular a couple of those quadrants where the bracket was really busted up with top 8 overall seeds and even kind of that next tier of seeds being taken. Uh, and Matt, when we talk about win probabilities, sometimes people might see, oh, this team was only given a 35% chance to win,
Yeah.
but they did. The computer was wrong. Well, no, I mean, even at 35%, the computer is saying that there's some chance that this team wins that game. But it was a good weekend for underdogs.
Yeah.
So if you look at all of the individual win probabilities, the computer would have said that there was about 7.41 expected wins out of underdogs in the opening round. It turned out to be 11. And then in round two, you take, I made a list there of that next group of games, like what the individual win probabilities were. And that came out to 3.59 expected wins out of underdogs. And it turned out to be seven. So definitely underdogs did outperform computer expectation in that regard.
Yeah, I think we had more of those 70-30 where the 30% wins won or the 60-40 games where the 40% won. I just went back quickly. I think the biggest upset, though, at least by our ratings, not necessarily what would be like bracket seed odds, was the Pitt Bradford game. And welcome back into the call, Zach. The Pitt Bradford game was like a 29%, a little bit over 29% odds. That was the biggest upset by our computer from what we had in last week's episode. So I think it's just kind of interesting. We did have a lot of underdogs, but it wasn't like we had a 90-10 game really where the 10% won. I think it was all like 25% or better when teams that won.
All right. Camera freezes and crashes, a D3 media tradition.
D3 problems. Yep.
Okay, so let's dive into our Sweet 16 preview, our matchup deep dive like we did for the first round games. Starting off with the number one overall seed, Wesleyan gets WPI in a game that the computer sees. Wesleyan is a heavy favorite, 88% overall win probability, and the computer sees Wesleyan as a 12.5 point favorite there at home against the team that the computer sees, teams that the computer sees ranked overall number 2 and number 23.
Yeah, I think a matchup Wesleyan and WPI, kind of surprising to see a computer line this big. Wesleyan 88% favorite, but I think that's kind of how it's been. Wesleyan spent most of the year undefeated. Just that NESCAC final loss against Trinity, Connecticut, who, by the way, the computer says is the other top one of the other top two teams in the country. So I guess that maybe it is not a surprise at the end of the day that they're still big favorites over WPI. Wesleyan will have the home court advantage there. So this line on this screen does take into account the home court advantage. So interesting to see if they can take advantage of that and move on to the Final Four or not.
Mary Washington will look to keep their Cinderella run going against Emory, who the computer has liked all year, sees Emory as the number 7 team overall. Mary Washington, though, we talk about them being a Cinderella, but the computer says, hey, this is the number 33 team in the
Yeah.
country, right? So it's not like they totally don't belong, at least in that regard. The computer sees Emory as a 76% win probability, leaving just 24% for Mary Washington, and would put a point spread of 8 points on this one.
Yeah, I don't think Emory is going to take Mary Washington lightly. This is the game that they're going to be able to prepare for, being the Friday night game. I think they saw what happened when you're facing a team in the Sweet 16. Yeah, you might say, okay, we could have had a worse opponent for us, but still, like Mary Washington, yeah, the computer sees them as a top 40 team. They've played a lot of tough teams. They've played, much of the ODAC in non-conference play. They've played Christopher Newport two or three times. They've played good teams. They've been able to win some of those games. They haven't been able to win all of them, but I think this is a battle-tested team, and I think no one's going to take Mary Washington lightly going on here. So I would expect Emory to come out ready to play this week in this matchup.
And then one interesting thing to point out here in this sectional, the tempos that these teams like to play at. You've got 3 teams in Wesleyan, WPI, and Mary Washington that are all ranked in that kind of mid 300s area. Emory, though, a top 100 tempo team, and it's going to, it translates to about a difference of about 6 or 7 possessions.
Yeah. And I think my impression of Emory is that they're a little bit more opportunistic in that they don't play necessarily fast, but they're willing to, if they have an advantage, a numbers advantage, they're willing to push it down the court or maybe throw it ahead to Jair, who can just throw it down or something like that. Also, maybe a couple turnovers they might force here and there, make things tough on you. But yeah, interesting to see that the other ones are very comfortable playing slow, and Emory, I think, can play either way.
On to Hartford, where Trinity is seen by the computer as a big favorite over Western New England. 15.5 point line on that one, 92% win probability for Trinity. Trinity is the computer's number 1 team there. So even though the computer likes Western New England just fine as a top 25 team, just the difference leads to quite a big projection in terms of how the computer sees this game playing out.
and could be a low scoring defensive battle. Both teams are ranked in the top 25 by defensive efficiency. Of course, Trinity's in the top 10 in offense as well, so I think they can score the ball. Both teams are good on both sides of the court. It's the Sweet 16, like everyone's good, right? So it'll be interesting to see how this matchup plays out. Western New England, had just beat Hamilton. They beat Montclair State. Another good team from a big conference is not going to throw them off. Definitely the computer thinks that Trinity is a relatively heavy favorite here and they'll have home court advantage. But I don't think anyone is also going to look past Western New England after what they did to Hamilton and then Montclair.
And then the computer, the matchup that the computer sees as the most even of next Friday, Roanoke and Catholic separated by just 2 spots in the computer rankings. Roanoke 13th overall, Catholic 11th overall. No surprise to see as even as it is a 49-51 split in terms of the win probability, just a half point in Catholic's favor. This is basically a toss up.
Catholic took a big step forward in these computer ratings after this weekend because of how strong they look. They actually jumped Roanoke and now are a couple of spots ahead of them. That's enough to push that neutral court line just ever so slightly in Catholic's favor. This will be a great one to tune in. This is almost like a must watch as far as even games. So who knows if that's how it's going to play out, but that's how it looks right now, playing this neutral court game at Trinity, which is kind of interesting, Zach. I think all 4 teams could get to Catholic within 500 miles. Roanoke cannot get to Trinity in under 500 miles. So I don't think we know exactly what went on there. If Catholic was not available to host the second weekend, or if the committee just was able to, I guess, add a potential flight to make it happen at Trinity. I don't think we know that yet, but just kind of, I was expecting this one to show up at Catholic and it didn't, and we don't know all the reasons behind the scenes why not.
Yeah. If for some reason Catholic was not available to be selected as a host, that would be an easy explanation. Yeah. If they were, then I think things get a little dicey. Or it seems quite clear that the women's committee tried to get an extra flight to be able to have Whitman host an opening weekend and couldn't get that bracket approved. So yeah. Interesting situation. I don't know if we'll get more details on that, but
if it turns out they just added the flight, don't tell Todd McGinnis that.
Yeah, of course, that was a problem a year ago as well. Okay, enough of that. That's a rabbit hole that you don't want to get lost in. All right, NYU will be hosting the sectional round at the expense of their women. Of course, the men were on the road in the first round because their women were hosting. One of those schools that is in that mix with women and men both being in position to host and having to be sent on the road one way or the other because of it. This time, NYU's back at home. They get Hardin-Simmons, where they are a heavy favorite. The computer likes NYU by 17.5 and gives them a win probability of 94%. NYU, another one of those teams, they've been a top team all year. They've got an elite adjusted efficiency margin. We were talking about them even earlier in the year when that number was even higher than some of those great Randolph-Macon teams of a few years back. That's kind of fallen back below that mark a bit. But whether you're talking about their efficiency on the offensive end or the defensive end, they are elite either way.
I'm going to do a little bit of Matt celebrating Matt here. I think I've had NYU really high in my poll all season long, even going back to the preseason. And I think I was maybe like the lone high voter on NYU. I don't know exactly where they were, if they were quite in my top 5, but they were around that spot. All season long, our computer ratings have had them up there. I think they've now pushed into that mix of for all voters essentially now 26-1 regular season. They look strong. They were They got through that first weekend. I mean, not like super easily, but relatively easy, all things considered. Now have a matchup with Hardin-Simmons, a game that looks fairly winnable for NYU. Hardin-Simmons is strong as well, so there's going to be no easy games from here on out, but this is one that the computer hangs a big line on. So it'll be interesting to see if NYU can keep that running or if Hardin-Simmons is going to have something where they can trip them up.
Earlier in the day there at NYU will be Hampton-Sydney taking on Redlands. Always an interesting matchup to see Redlands take on anybody just because not a lot of teams have to face a team that plays like Redlands does. We'll see how that plays out, but just in terms of the raw numbers that feed into the computer here, Hampton-Sydney is a 1.5 point favorite. The computer puts the odds in terms of win probabilities split at 56 for Hampton-Sydney, 44 for Redlands. And then, no surprise, Redlands has that highest adjusted tempo number of anyone left in the field. But Hampton City, I feel like while their overall tempo isn't uh, earth shattering, in fact, it's slightly below average. They feel like a team that also would be comfortable kind of getting out in the open court. Maybe not quite as opportunistic as an Emory, who does have a tempo number that looks a little bit higher. But maybe we saw that a little bit more a year ago. But Adam Brazel's a guy who can push it in the open floor
Yeah.
and make some things happen. So it'll be interesting to see, and especially when you talk about the pressure that Redlands puts on an offense, having that senior veteran
Yeah.
experienced point guard really could be something that's in the Tigers' favor. So interesting matchup to see play out.
You do need more than one person to handle the ball, though.
Very true.
Against Redlands, I think you can't just get by with one person either dribbling past. You got to move the ball. You got to move it up the court. You got to make smart, clean passes before the defense kind of collapses on you. I'm always just interested whenever there's a Redlands game when they're playing at this high of a level, just to see how those matchups go. I think because they can. We just saw them beat Tufts, right? So and for the reasons you said, though, I'm interested. I think Hampton-Sydney can get past that. I think they're the type of team that maybe can survive that. But Redlands makes things tough on everyone. The other top teams in the ODAC traditionally are teams like Guilford and Randolph-Macon. They're not playing super fast. They're a little bit more of we're going to maybe grind you out possession kind of a team. So I'm really fascinated to see the Redlands and Hampton-Sydney matchup. Again, another like Virginia versus Southern California, this time played in New York City. It'll be interesting.
Wisconsin Lutheran meets up with Wash U in a very interesting rematch that we talked about from a classic tournament game a year ago. It's got to be one that the Wisconsin Lutheran guys are looking forward to getting another crack at Wash U. But again, the Wash U guys got to be thinking back to last year. And, that was a game really they won, but they were fortunate to win. There were a lot of times watching that game play out that I thought Wisconsin Lutheran was going to pull off that upset. So looking forward to this. The computer does see Wisconsin Lutheran as a 5.5 point underdog. Kind of a 70-30-ish type game in terms of the split in win probability breakdown. 68% for Wash U, 32% for Wisconsin Lutheran.
I'm really glad that this game gets to happen in this tournament after last year's game. What was that? It was an overtime game that Wash U won, if I have that correct. And I'm also glad that this happens in the second weekend, not the first weekend. The way the matchups fell. Well, actually, I guess I'm not happy because I would have rather that Calvin been here. But
I was waiting for that.
Like that whole dynamic aside, once I can get myself past that point, realize like, okay, this is in a lot of ways probably right. These Wisconsin Lutheran players who took the opportunity to return with the 5th year eligibility to see what they could do in a tournament like this, and now to come up against Wash U, who was like this game that they almost won last year in the tournament when they were big underdogs. Now you're the team that has been in that national mix all season long. You're back in the Sweet 16 saying, yes, we did in fact indeed belong. And now you can go back to that team this time on a neutral court and say, like, do we have the opportunity to win it? So it just kind of to me feels like the narrative around this game could be like, this is the game we came back for. I know Wisconsin Lutheran wants to win and then win more, but like this could be it for them. I'm fascinated for this from both sides. Wash U has been in that like top 10-ish, maybe top 5-ish mix for a lot of the nationally for a lot of the season. This is a game that they can and could win. But this is like these 4 teams left in this quadrant, I think are all really interesting for a lot of reasons. And we can get to that, but just love this matchup. This is just a fun, I think, D3 matchup for this tournament season.
And the fact that it's happening in a Sweet 16 means the committee couldn't necessarily plan for this kind of thing, but it reminds me of, after we had that tournament that was cut short by COVID and we had those Sweet 16 matchups that were just kind of left hanging there, in that next time we did have a tournament, there were a few matchups that were kind of nods to those unplayed Sweet 16, right? So this is a really fun callback. Again, not quite in the same manner, but certainly has a bit of that feel given what took place a year ago. All right, one more game to talk about, Matt. It's another one the computer sees really close. UW La Crosse is the computer's number 15 team. Illinois Wesleyan is the computer's number 12 team. A little bit of a different dynamic than we talked about, just the 2 spots separating Roanoke and Catholic, because this is not a neutral court game. This sectional is hosted at Wisconsin La Crosse, so there is a bit of home court that comes into play in terms of the actual like prediction breakdown from the computer. And with that in mind, La Crosse comes out as a 57% win probability and a 2-point favorite on like a point spread.
Yeah, neutral court odds. This would have been just slightly in favor of Illinois Wesleyan, who our computer ratings see as a few spots higher than Wisconsin lacrosse, but being played in lacrosse, that will change maybe what your expectation is a little bit here. This is another great matchup. Illinois Wesleyan, they had that Bethany Lutheran game, but then they had to play St. John's. Now there's UW lacrosse. The winner of this game is going to get like Wash U or Wisconsin Lutheran. You look at how the computer rating rankings on this pod, number 18, number 6, number 15, number 12, compared to the rest of the country. Everyone's good. Like, you're not going to get easy game in the Sweet 16, but this is 4 teams that are all ranked in the top 20 of the computer ratings, whereas every other pod has teams maybe just outside of that kind of range. That Trinity Connecticut one is also similar. But yeah, I think it's 4 kind of evenish teams, and no matter which way the first round games go, the Elite 8 game is going to be like another even looking matchup.
So to put some of these win probabilities in another context, the computer can tell us what maybe the most likely outcomes are, but built into that is some sort of expectation that upsets will happen. And based on those win probabilities, it can maybe give an indication of where they are or aren't as likely to happen. But if you take them all in aggregate, uh, the the computer would set an expected wins of about 2.18 for underdogs. So again, compare that to what happened in the opening weekend where underdogs did outperform that. So we'll see what happens, but just to set that computer expectation for how many underdogs would be expected to win. Again, we don't know where they're going to be, but the computer expectation would be that something like 2 or 3 would happen. Yeah.
Yep. And I want to call it an error. It looks like on the screen, Redlands is shown as the number 5 seed in that quadrant. I think they're the number 7 seed if you went by like bracket seeds. Not necessarily what their NPI rank would have been among those teams, but just kind of where they are in the bracket. I should have called them the number 7.
I think 10, actually.
My apologies. Well, okay. It's not clear who was the 7 and who was the 10 because the way they're listed on the bracket, yes, St. Joseph's was the 7 and Redlands was the 10. But I think in NPI, St. Redlands was just above St. Joseph's. So if you wanted that matchup and then put them in NPI order, it should have been 7-10, Redlands as the 7.
But right. Redlands was 1 NPA spot higher. So yes. Yeah, okay.
So anyway, either way, I wrote it wrong.
Either way, you're wrong, and that's all that we really need to know.
Yep.
All right, so that's drilling into the Sweet 16. Now let's zoom back out and look at our overall bracket odds, see who the favorites are to advance, like we did before the first round. But now we've got actual results, right? And we're down to just 16 teams. So we're looking ahead from the Sweet 16 onward, and Trinity, Connecticut, they entered the tournament as the one with the best championship odds according to the computer, and they remain that here heading into the second weekend. Your final 4 favorites, just running it down, the computer sees Wesleyan, Trinity, Connecticut, New York University, and Wash U as the favorites. And part of that, Matt, let's go down to that bottom sectional there. Wash U is maybe the computer favorite to go on to the final 4, but that's a number less than 50%. Part of that is just because of uncertainty as to who's coming out of that Illinois Wesleyan UW lacrosse game, right? And so the computer being a little bit more confident in Wash U, that Wash U will be in that game, that kind of boosts their odds a little bit.
Yeah, like we were mentioning before, it's 4 evenish teams. Wash U is rated the highest of those 4 by the computer, so they get the strongest odds. But yeah, it's whoever ends up coming out of that Illinois Wesleyan UW lacrosse games would get odds, probably on their own closer to 40%. So that becomes more of a 50-50 type looking bracket once you get to the Elite 8, no matter who comes out of that. It's just that it looks like Wash U is rated slightly stronger. Trinity, Connecticut going up a little bit higher. They were the favorite to win the whole thing coming into the opening weekend. They are the favorites again still. Their championship odds went up by about 3.8 percentage points, which isn't a ton, but you figure their first game was kind of like a 90-something% chance of a game. So there's not a whole, when you already have, nearly 30% odds to win the whole thing, there's not a lot of room you can go up by just winning the opening weekend. I think NYU, though, was the big winner in terms of overall championship odds. They gained 11 percentage points from last week. I think the couple things may be interacting here. When you look at teams remaining, the computer thinks that this is the weakest overall kind of Sweet 16 round with NYU ranked third overall, but then Hardin-Simmons 54, Redlands 30, Hampton-Sydney 19. And then you kind of look at their half of the bracket, and then you say, okay, yeah, those other four teams remaining are good, but UW-Platteville was like the number one seed in that same half of the bracket as NYU, and they're already gone. So the computer kind of thinks that NYU has had some larger obstacles cleared, whereas other quadrants don't necessarily have obstacles cleared the same way. But as we talked about, even though Platteville's out of the mix, that bottom quadrant is still the only one with four top 20 teams by the computer rating. So it's not like whoever gets out of there is going to be weak slightly. Maybe other interesting point I'll make on odds, Zach, is that Wesleyan's odds actually went down a little bit from first weekend to second weekend. I think that's something you don't usually see when you win games, but I think a couple things at play. Some of your odds that you have early in the tournament are that you might play weaker teams if they happen to get upset. Well, they're going to play their most difficult potential matchup in WPI, right? 1 versus 4 in the Sweet 16. That's your most difficult matchup. Emory's also still in the mix, still as kind of the number 2 in their quadrant. And then, Trinity is maybe the most likely matchup if they reach the Final Four. So it looks like the path that Wesleyan is getting ends up being just about the most difficult one that they could have charted when the thing started. So that's not to say they can't get through it, but it's what is potential versus what is actual. They get a more difficult path than maybe they had to get, just based on a couple of big favorites so far winning around them. We'll have to see if that keeps happening or not. But I think that's one thing that's in play to make a team like Wesleyan look like a couple of percentage points lower than they did a week ago.
Yeah, good stuff. There's definitely, in terms of overall championship odds, the three that have, double digit odds really stand out there with Wesleyan, Trinity, and NYU. But just, look ahead. Emory's still there at 5%, Wash U 6.8%. But it's that grouping down there that's really interesting, and I think really going to be the games to watch there. The grouping of Wash U, Illinois Wesleyan, and UW La Crosse, because it's one of those situations where the individual numbers aren't great, but as we start finding out who's going to convert whatever those win probabilities are to, a 100% in their favor, those are going to start accumulating, right? And
Yeah.
I think that's when you're going to start seeing whoever comes out of that quadrant, really see those numbers rise. Right now, it's all kind of tamped down because of, could be them, could be them, could be them, right? It's all a bunch of really even games, and that, odds quickly dilute as you're talking about a series of coin flips, essentially.
Yeah. And you think of, we mentioned where Trine was last year, right? They were a team that was
Right.
ranked by our efficiency ratings in the teens coming into the Final Four weekend. Even I think they were, even coming into the Final Four, our computer was only showing like 4% odds or something like that for them to win the championship, and they do. So things happen. You can win games. That's the fun thing about a tournament. Is we talk about this for fun, but it doesn't matter at the end of the day what these things say. It's about what's going to happen on the court, and those 5 guys on the floor at any given time have a lot to say about what's going to happen.
So I pulled it up here just as you were talking about that. So let's go back to this exact view. Last year, Trine came in to the second weekend. That number there, all the way to the right, in their percentage to win the championship, that number for Trine was 1%.
Yep.
Right. So, you might see a Hampton-Sydney, a 1.1% number.
Roanoke.
That's,
Yep.
yeah. You look at those numbers that are kind of in that range. That's where Trine was last year, right?
Yep.
So it's not to say you don't have a chance, right? It's all about the variability of potential outcomes at this point. But Trine was some craziness happened that got them to the Final Four. But that Final Four weekend, I don't think there was any doubt they were
Yep.
playing great.
And 16 teams left, so 1 out of 16 is like 6% or so. That would be like the average odds if teams were all even strength. We know they're not all even strength. Some are teams like Wesleyan have won almost all their games, right? Trinity, NYU. So they have higher odds than that. But if you're in that like 6% range, that's still like kind of averagey.
Okay, should we go on to the picks? We covered it. We
Let's do
covered
our
last
picks.
weekend.
Yep.
We covered next weekend. Let's cover how we did.
All right, Zach, these are the 5 games we picked from the first weekend to pick against. First one was Redlands. They were 2-point underdogs in that game against St. Joseph's on a neutral court. They won that game by 10, and we both picked that one correctly. Zach, we were both incorrect in the next game. St. Norbert against Carthage was a pick 'em, and St. Norbert won that game by 3. We both went with Carthage, but St. Norbert won, and we both missed that pick. Catholic and Franklin and Marshall. Zach, I went with Catholic. You went with Franklin and Marshall against a 4.5 computer line. Catholic was the underdogs by the computer, but they won big, and so I get that point. John Carroll at York, Pennsylvania, half-point favorite was York, and they did win that game outright even, so we both missed that pick. And our game
That
of the
score's
week.
wrong, but that's okay.
Oh, the score's wrong, but they it was a lot
It was
closer
a
than that. It was
2-point
a
game, not a
2-point game.
12-point game.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
2 points, not 12. And then our game of the week was St. John's versus Chicago. That ended up being a really good one. St. John's wins when Chicago was unable to convert at or near the buzzer. We had both picked St. John's by 1. Is that a 1-point score, though? Did we push that game?
Oh, I guess we did we?
Yeah, that's a
Well,
push.
everything's wrong here. All right, we'll get that updated.
Okay, we pushed. We pushed that one. So where does that go? So Zach, you were we had both gotten credit for a win on that one, right? So you
Right,
were
so we need to take away a win from each side and add a push to each side.
yeah. So you were 1-3-1 overall. You will be 40, 45, and 5. 5 pushes this year.
That's crazy.
I was 2-2-1, and I am 46, 39, and 5. Zach, so you have some work to do to catch up to me. You've got to have great weeks all the way out. So let's go to this week's picks, and we will try to get the numbers correct. First game is Catholic and Roanoke. Only 8 games left, right? So we have to pick against 5 of them, or at least known games, so Sweet 16 games. So we have to pick against 5 of them. Catholic is the half-point favorite against Roanoke. This is neutral court. Zach, your pick.
Yeah, we talked about the great weekend Catholic had. Are they going to keep it going? They might, but I'm going to go with Roanoke. Matt, you talked about how every Roanoke game seems to be a close game. So that's the way that the line is. Give me Roanoke. They're used to playing in those type of games. Josh McClary was clutch last weekend. He can do it again.
All right, I'm maybe reacting to what I just recently saw, but Catholic looked great. Roanoke found the way to win 2 games, but didn't always look great doing it. I guess credit, you got to just win the games in March, and it doesn't matter how you do it. So maybe I shouldn't give them any negative credit for that. But Catholic was amazing. I'm just going to go with Catholic to keep rolling and win this game outright. Redlands and Hampton Sydney, Zach, that's a 2-point line in favor of Hampton Sydney. Also played on a neutral court. How do you pick?
Redlands is so difficult to play against. Maybe that causes me to lean their way a little bit more than I should. And, 2's not a big number here, but I'm going to go with the Bulldogs.
All right, you're taking Redlands, Zach. I'm going to go with Hampton Sydney. I think it's another cross-country flight that Redlands has to take. I don't know if they're going back and forth or if they're going to stay on the East Coast or what, but I think that's a lot of travel no matter what, or a lot of time away from home. This is a close game, so I'm essentially picking a winner. Maybe I think it'll be pretty close, but I'm going to pick Hampton Sydney even to give the 2 points there. I think it'll be tight, but I'm going to go with that one. Wisconsin Lutheran and Wash U. Wash U are 5.5-point favorites. This is neutral court at UW La Crosse. Zach, your pick.
Yeah, for all the reasons we've talked about this game already, I think it's going to be close. So the 5.5 is enough that, even if Wash U pulls it out, I expect a game that's, a possession or 2. Give me the 5.5.
Zach, I don't think Wisconsin Lutheran is going to sneak up on Wash U. Wisconsin Lutheran has played great in their 2 games this year, so I don't think they've really snuck up on anyone, and all season long they've been in the national mix. So maybe I shouldn't. Maybe they're just good, and it's not like they're sneaking up on anyone. But I think Wash U is prepared for this game. I think they remember how last year went, how they nearly lost that game on their home floor. I'm going to go with Wash U, even given the 5.5-point line. I think Wash U is going to win this game by at least 2 possessions. WPI at Wesleyan is our 4th game. This is a big line, 12.5 points in favor of the home Wesleyan team. Zach, what's your pick?
It is a big number and one that I usually would try to shy away from. But knowing that, I figured you would also try to shy away from it. And knowing that I've got ground I need to make up. I will lay the 12.5 and take Wesleyan.
Yeah, I mean, I guess at the end of the day, I wouldn't be too shocked if Wesleyan won this game by 13 or more, but that was just such a big line. I'm just going to have to go play the line game and pick WPI to keep this one, kind of within 10-ish points and go with WPI. And our D3 Datacast game of the week is up in UW La Crosse. It's Illinois Wesleyan at UW La Crosse. 2-point line in favor of La Crosse. How do you pick, Zach?
I'm going to go with Illinois Wesleyan here, even though it's a true road game. I feel like these are two teams that at their best are as good as anyone, but maybe you don't always see the best version of them. So it's just a matter of who's going to be better that night. But with 2 points to work with, and I think maybe just a few more matchup problems for La Crosse, I will take Illinois Wesleyan.
Yeah, Zach, I'm going to go the same direction as you and take Illinois Wesleyan. I think they've been locked in the last couple weeks. They knew that they didn't need to win the CCIW tournament to get in, but to kind of get to keep themselves in that kind of top 16 mix, I think they needed to do it. They went in, they beat Carthage, who they had lost to twice. Then this weekend getting the pod in Chicago that they couldn't host because of their women's team hosting, going out and just taking care of business against Bethany Lutheran, and then winning that really tough second round matchup against St. John's. They just were in it every possession. We knew that was going to be a tight game. It was, and they found a way to win at the end. I think this game is going to be similar to that. I think they're going to find their way to win. At least keep it close, but I think they can win this game by 1 or 2 points or something like that. They're going to cover that +2 line. So I'm going to go with the Titans. So that's the picks.
That's the picks. The option for games to put on the slate is dwindling, but in terms of just the raw number of games, but I feel like we could pick every single game and it would be very interesting because the games are so good.
Yeah.
Love it. All right. A lot of opportunities for me to make up ground there too, Matt. All right, we got another weekend of basketball to watch. Can't wait to see how it plays out. Can't wait to see which 4 teams we will be seeing when we move on to Fort Wayne. Should be a lot of fun, Matt. Enjoy the games. Let's say thank you to our great group of supporters through the Patreon platform at patreon.com/D3 Datacast. Special shout out to Stuart McCallum, who joined us this week as a great job team supporter. Appreciate Stuart's support and the ongoing support of everyone else here on this here list.
Yeah, thanks to everyone who's watched our show, shared our show, especially those of you on the screen who joined us on Patreon, patreon.com/D3Datacast. We have a $5 a month tier and a $3 a month tier. That's good job team level and great job team level. Thanks so much. It helps us out to make these episodes and keep D3Datacast.com ad-free. Zach, I'm excited for our Sweet 16 Elite 8 sectional round this weekend. The tournament is going hot and heavy. The end is almost here. Let's go watch the games this week. Let's get ready for the games. For now, we're going to say, good job, team.